Hello, my name is Michael Sheehan. Along with Neil Ronk, I moderate the Lansdowne History Forum. We had a meeting on last Thursday, and in the recording, we missed the first half. So I'm going to kind of summarize what happened in the first half, and you'll have videos for part one and part two on our website, which is found at, all one word, lansdownehistoryforum.wordpress.com. Again, a little glitch, and so we didn't record part of it, so I'm going to get that in. What I'm going to do is start by explaining that this is part of a 3 or maybe 4-year program that we're going to pursue. It's an idea that I had as a way to celebrate my retirement, something to do, something to keep my mind active. And I had tried 3 or 4 or 5 different things, and none of them really stuck with me. And then I came up with this idea using the Lansdowne History Forum as a kind of a disciplinary help. It's going to be again, minimum 3-year program looking at the history of my lifetime, starting from the Cold War and going up to January 6th, the insurrection at Washington, D.C. The plan is that the first year is going to cover basically the beginnings of the Cold War up through the Cuban Missile Crisis. The second one is going to cover a lot of things. It's going to cover the rise of the counterculture. It's going to cover the anti-war movement. It's going to cover civil rights and liberation movements. That may prove to be too much for 1 year, so we may have to add an additional year. And the last year is going to take us from the Reagan Revolution to the fall of the Soviet Union, to the War on Terror, to the various polarization that we are enduring in our politics right now, and ending probably on the insurrection on January 6th. That's the plan. I do believe we'll need a 4th year for that, but each month we'll take one topic and try and explore it thoroughly. Now, in this part, because I'm just recording myself, I'll be the only voice. When we have the meetings, the rules are anybody can interrupt at any time with a question, a comment, a little diatribe of their own. It's all welcome here. Again, nobody's politics are out of line. If you believe one thing and I believe another, that's absolutely fine. We'll talk, we'll have a conversation, and we'll try and figure out what the history of this time period has meant. And I'm interested in this for obvious reasons. One, just to understand history and understand how we got to where we are, but also this is my history. This is history that formed me, that shaped me, that all my thoughts and ideas and attitudes come out of the experience of the Cold War and the counterculture in the 1960s. Again, if you think about how many things happened if you're in my age group, in my lifetime, I have a list here. There's the Cold War, there's McCarthyism, there's the Cuban Missile Crisis, there's the atomic age with the nuclear bombs and all that we have here, and the arms race that goes with that. There's all the various liberation, civil rights movements that we've watched, whether it's LGBTQ plus, or whether it's Black civil rights, or whether it's women's equal rights amendment movement. All of these things happened during my lifetime. There's also the election of the first Black president. There's also the Reagan Revolution. There's also the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. And then there's very quickly thereafter, the War on Terror, of course, which has kind of replaced the Cold War for us. There's that implacable enemy, and we're back in the midst of unending wars. Just recently, in a very messy fashion, we pulled out of Afghanistan, but we've been there for 20 years. And that seems to have been our history from the 1950s on. That having been said, I look at all that disparate list of things and say, what ties it together? And then it came to me. From the time I took my first breath on this planet, we were a superpower. America was a superpower. I've never known a different world than that. But that's about 1/3 of American history. For most of our history, we were not a superpower. So the question is, what is the difference between America today and what we were prior to Pearl Harbor? Pearl Harbor is the fulcrum event in this history. That is where we moved onto center stage and little by little took the main role in trying to maintain order and peace in the world. You know, back in the day, there was Pax Britannica. You want to go centuries back before that, we had Pax Romanum. Well, now we've got Pax Americana, and there's a lot of responsibility. Prior to that, if you would say one word that described America and its foreign policy, I'd have said isolationism. That's who we were. We didn't want involvement. We didn't want to get involved in everybody's wars. We didn't want to get involved in all the cost in blood and treasure of maintaining peace around the world, and maybe at the cost to our own economy and our own well-being. We didn't want that. George Washington in his farewell address said, he warned us against that. Do not get involved. He was speaking specifically of Europe, but he meant the world in all their messes, because there will be a mess every 2, 3, 5 years. I mean, if we think about British and French history in the period when George Washington was president, they were constantly at war, and they wanted both to draw us in on their side. And Washington said no to that. And we followed him for a century and a half. You know, it's only after Pearl Harbor and the end of World War II and the entry of the atomic age that we realized that our safety, or we decided that our safety, depended on taking a central role in ordering the stability of the international world. Before that, we rejected it. We didn't want anything to do with it. Now, because I have technology here, I am going to be able to show some documents that will be helpful, that I couldn't if we were meeting in the Bainey room. And let me see here. All right. On our website, again, which is at lansdownehistoryforum.wordpress.com, we have the agenda for this year. This year's agenda is set in stone. This is what we're doing. The next 2 or 3 years, I have a general idea of what I want in them, but there will be some changes made, additions and subtractions and reorganizing. But for this year, this month, we are doing Before We Were a Superpower, that period from 1787, with the writing of the Constitution, up until Pearl Harbor. We were not a superpower. We were an isolationist nation. You have to understand what it means to be a superpower. To be a superpower doesn't mean you're rich and you have a great military. It means you take responsibility for the world order. It means that you are involved in alliances in every corner of the globe. Jokingly, I wrote in an essay that each month we have an essay on our webpage in which I try and summarize what my thoughts on the topic are. And in my essay, I say, if somebody sneezes in Lebanon, the next morning they'll ask the President of the United States, what are you going to do about that? Because it is assumed that we have responsibility for all these things. So we're going to look at that period beforehand, when for almost the entire 150 years, we were isolationist, with 2 important exceptions, and also with an understanding that sometimes vocabulary is what you want it to mean. We described ourselves as isolationists because we said we're not imperialists like the Europeans are, who go around the globe and take and colonize in Africa, in Southeast Asia, in the Middle East, wherever it might be. But we said we didn't do that. Again, we decided it was ordained by God that we had a right to this continent. And therefore, we moved westward and we pushed the Native Americans off their land. But we didn't call that imperialism. We didn't call that colonization. We called it manifest destiny, ordained by God. And we were just doing what God wanted us to do, to take this republic of ours and spread it across the whole breadth of the continent. Now, somebody else can look at that and say, that sounds an awful lot like imperialism to me. But we did not define it that way for ourselves. And as long as we stayed within the borders of this continent, we were not an imperialist, greedy nation. Again, those are our definitions. All right, the next month, by the way, we always meet on the 3rd Thursday of each month from 7:30 to about 9, is the origins of the Cold War. And again, you can read this agenda on our website. But we're looking at how we got started in this Cold War. And you know, one of the important things about fighting a war is not just winning the war, but winning the peace that follows. And after World War I, the peace was a disaster, and it led immediately to World War II. We were determined that would not happen after World War II, but we got ourselves into a 70-year Cold War with the Soviet Union. The next is the atomic age. If there's anything that changed our world, boy, it's not just the Manhattan Project, it is the atomic age. Then we're going to follow the rise of the military-industrial complex. In the founders of our country would have turned over in their graves at the idea of a military-industrial complex. We don't even think about it. It's part of the backdrop of our lives. Of course, there's a military-industrial complex. Hasn't there always been? No. The founding fathers were fearful of the idea of a standing army and a military-industrial complex. It allows the government to become tyrannical. That's what they would have said to us. Now, it's an accepted fact of our existence. Not that there aren't people who don't complain about it and rail against it. There are, but it's there, and it doesn't seem to be moving. Next is the Marshall Plan, which is to be understood both as a very beneficent action on the part of the United States, but also to be understood as part of the Cold War. In the Cold War, we were trying to get allies, spheres of influence that were countries that would be on our side, and the Soviet Union was doing the same. And the money we gave through the Marshall Plan helped to secure the loyalty of various countries to our side of the issue. Next is the Suez Crisis, which is a major event in which, if France and England had been the superpowers prior to World War II, they tried to maintain that role afterwards. In the Suez, Eisenhower basically pushed France and England aside and said, you guys have messed things up enough. It's our turn. We'll take over. Then we get to McCarthy and Hoover, and more there, it's looking at the kind of paranoia that comes out of Cold War thinking. And we'll get that will be an interesting one for a lot of us. The next thing is an area that I think as Americans, we don't pay enough attention to: the Cold War and third world countries. What we have to understand, we thought that during the 50s and 60s and 70s, there were really only two sides. There was America and there was the Soviet Union. The third world were throwing off all the chains of the colonial empires that Europe had had. I think in the first 5 years after World War II ended, something like 73 new nations, former colonies, joined the United Nations. That's as big a story as the Cold War, only we don't study it. When we study Vietnam, we talk about it as a Cold War event. In Southeast Asia, they called it an anti-colonial event. They were breaking free of French colonial rule. And then the last one for this year is nuclear brinkmanship, US and Cuba, the Cuban Missile Crisis. I was very young when it happened, but I do remember it. And certainly I've read about it since, and I think a lot of us remember a lot about it. Okay, that's the agenda for this year. Now, let me get back to what we were doing here. Again, I think this will be a 4-year program. We have been a superpower for the last 70 years. And to understand what, again, repeating myself, what it means to be a superpower is not just that we have the power, military and economic, but that we exercise it around the globe and take responsibilities. Washington has said, don't belong to any alliances. They will pull you in. And this will show you how strong Washington was in that belief. When we were fighting the Revolutionary War, we needed help. We needed the help of France. And France brought her navy at great expense when she was suffering great economic difficulties herself to our Atlantic shores. And their help was essential in defeating the British. But the French asked us to sign a treaty, exactly the kind of thing that Washington would have said, we don't want to do. And it said, in time of war for them, they would call on us to help them. Well, during the Washington administration, England and France went to war. No surprise. That's something they did on a regular basis there. And France came to us and said, we need you. Sign up. Come on. Give us the aid. We helped you. And Washington said no. And the French were horrified, angry, pissed off. But Washington said, no, 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 we're not getting involved in these European wars. They're going to go on forever and they're going to cost us. They're going to hurt us. So, and to make it even worse, he said, and because one of the things that is really important to us is growing our economy and our trade, we feel free in our neutrality to trade with both sides. So the French are looking, not only you're not helping us, your trade is help with Britain is helping them. But Washington's held firm. And we could say that's a dishonorable action on his part, but it was also a principle that he felt very firmly about, that as a country, we could not survive unless we kept out of Europe's messes. And because again, they would be constant. If we look at America today, Washington would roll over in his grave. I mean, he, in his farewell warning address, he gave two warnings. One, no factionalism, no political parties, because they lead to polarization. Excuse me, where are we living today? In a country whose politics are so polarized that it's hard to get anything done in government. Washington would have said, I told you so. Of course, he was witness to it firsthand. Within his cabinet, he had Hamilton, Adams, and Jefferson. Hamilton and Adams were the originators of the Federalist Party, and Jefferson of the Democratic Republicans. And they were as polarized a set of parties as can exist, maybe even more polarized than our current Republican and Democratic parties. And he said, no, you can't do this. Well, easier said than done. But the other and the more important thing that we're focusing on, because being a superpower is about foreign affairs, he said, no alliances. Well, you think about the world today. I have a list here. We belong to the UN, to NATO, to CETO, to the G20 group, to the G7 group, to the IMF, to the World Bank, and dozens of more alliances. And we have bilateral and multilateral economic agreements, trade agreements. Again, we are tied into every corner of the globe, and we have military bases around the globe. The expenses of maintaining that are tremendous. And then very often they break out into wars, and the cost becomes exponentially greater, both in treasure and in human casualties. But that's where we are. Now, if we go back in time, if we go back before Pearl Harbor, we were an isolationist nation. Now, what I want to do is define isolationism, because isolationism for most people just means keeping out of other people's business, staying, closed in within your borders. And obviously that is in a major way what it is. I mean, the first element of it is no geopolitical alliances. We wanted to be just left alone because we thought we had we had two jobs to do. We had one, to settle a continent. Again, we're not going to call it imperialism, but we're taking land that belonged to the Indians, or later in the war with Mexico in 1848, we're going to take all of the Southwest and California from the Mexicans. But we want to be left alone to settle that continent, to prosper economically and commercially. And also, and this is really key here, it was a part of our religion as Americans that we believed that we had an experiment in Republican democracy that would be a light for the rest of the world to look at, that we would provide an example. The idea is American exceptionalism, that we were doing something that no one else had ever done before. And if we could succeed, well, it could change the world. And Washington believed, and in the 150 years after he left office, America, as a general consensus, believed that if we got involved in world international affairs with questions of balance of power and all these things, we would be corrupted, that the ideals of the American Democratic Republic would be corrupted. And history shows that, yeah, that's what happens. If you look at the 50s and the 60s, all during the Cold War, how many 2-bit dictators did we cozy up to? Because they would take our side against the Soviet Union, even though they were people who we should not have embraced, but we did, because the pragmatics of maintaining your status and power in the world vis-a-vis the Soviet Union required realigning the world and getting as many people on our side as possible. So there's a lot that goes with isolationism. Now, I've brought it to 5 ideas, and I think I have a document there that I'm going to show you. So I'm going to go to share screen again. And this may take me a second here. You have to excuse me. Here it is. Coming up. All right. There are 5 elements of American isolationism. The first is obvious. No American entanglement, no foreign entanglements, excuse me. The second, a messianic belief in American exceptionalism. And what I want to link this to number 4, a tendency towards nativism. Part of what we believed in our special exceptional quality is that it was only possible because of our heritage from the Anglo-Saxon culture, that it was a superior culture and that other cultures were not necessarily capable of maintaining or sustaining or living within or under a great experiment like this one. And so we tended towards nativism. We had opportunities in the 19th century to annex various countries, Honduras, Guatemala, Cuba, Haiti, the Dominican Republic, Hawaii, among others, and we turned them down. Now, we didn't turn them down for moral reasons that we're not going to be imperialist. One of the major reasons we turned them down was the people who lived in these countries were either indigenous peoples, Hispanics, Catholics, or of African descent. And we were not sure that they were capable of embodying what was required of our great experiment. I mean, we fought the Mexican War in 1848. Arizona doesn't become a state until like 1912. And the reason is a real simple one. Too many Native Americans and Mexicans lived there. And there's a senator from Indiana, Albert Beveridge was his name. And you can read what he has to say in the congressional record, where he says, Arizona will not become a state until there are more white Anglo-Saxons there. That's what he believed. And that's what a lot of Americans believed. And so that tendency towards nativism, and we can see it today, whether it's fear of Muslims or whatever group it might be, or concerns over the border and who's coming across, that there is a tendency to fear the other, to distrust the other, to think the other is lesser. And, if we think we are something exceptional, by definition, we think others are not exceptional. And in that, again, it causes a rift, a problem. But we did believe, and here we avoid calling ourselves imperialists, we did believe in hemispheric hegemony. The Americas, both North and South and the Caribbean, were part of the world that we should have control over, and that the Europeans and whomever else should keep out. And we would codify that in the Monroe Doctrine, but we believed we had the right to this. It was, again, our manifest destiny, and that is what we would do. Now, if this belief in American exceptionalism was part of the religion of what it meant to be an American, protecting our commerce and industry and allowing it to prosper was a second tenet of our religion. You could mess with a lot of things, but do not mess with our commerce, with our trade, with our economy. For Americans, that is essential. All right, I'm going to stop this. And I'm back again here. You can see what is going on in the first three wars that America fights. We fight three wars: a quasi-naval war with France. Now, it's called a quasi-war because it wasn't declared. But if you're shooting at each other and killing each other, it's a war. There was a war with Great Britain, the War of 1812, and there was a war against the Tripoli pirates under Jefferson. It brings in the problem of factionalism too. Jefferson and Adams, the Democrat Republicans and the Federalists, they were 100% in disagreement on almost any topic you could meant. They were as polarized as you could be. And the Hamiltonians or the Federalists, they wanted to have an alliance with England, and they didn't like French. They didn't like what was going on in the French Revolution. They thought that was radical stuff that was scary, and we didn't want to import that into our country. It would destroy our democratic republic. And Jefferson said it the exact opposite, that the French Revolution was an embodiment of the ideals of the democratic republic, throwing off a monarchy. And we wanted an alliance with France, but we sure didn't want one with England. They were the monarchists who ruled us, and we had to fight a long, hard war in order to gain our freedom from them. Well, Adams and the Federalists get into power first, so they get into a war with France. Now, why did we get into a war with France? Well, one of the reasons is pretty easy. It's economic. France was angry at our trading with Britain while they were at war with Britain. So what did they do? They started stopping our ships, taking our cargo, hurting our economy, and then impressing some of our sailors into the French Navy. Well, that's cause for war. And we did go to war. Okay, time passes, not too many years. 1800, Jefferson becomes president. He defeats Adams in one of the most important presidential elections of our history. The first time there was a peaceful transfer of power, which is a phrase that should be really resonant for us today with what's going on with the question of, did Biden get legitimately elected? Was there fraud? We've been going through this for the better part of a year now, and they managed it in 1800. At any rate, now we have a problem with the British. This is going to be in Madison's presidency, not Jefferson's. What are they doing? Well, they're doing two things. One, they're doing exactly what the French did. They're stopping our ships. They're taking our cargo. They're impressing our sailors. And in addition to that, they were supposed to have abandoned forts in our northwestern frontiers, but they didn't abandon them. And Manifest Destiny said, Europeans out, Americans will take control of this continent, and we will brook no interference from them. And we went to war. But again, in the early days of our country, you want to go to war? You want America to join a war with you? Hurt our economy, affect our trade, hurt our commerce. Them are fighting words. And again, we got into those wars. The third war is the Tripoli Pirate Wars. And what was it that the Tripoli pirates were doing? They were doing what pirates do. They were stopping ships and robbing them. And they were very effectively doing that. They were hurting our economy in a significant way. And by this time we had built up this is under Jefferson now, we had built up a sizable Navy, and we said, we're going to take them down. And we did. We, to the shores of AAA, we went there. Again, we will not allow anybody to interfere with our commerce. All right. The next thing I want to do is to look at our frame of reference in looking at American history. And I'm going to put up one other document. This will be my last one. And take me a second. And this one will all say divisions. Here it is. Normally, we divide history up into in small chunks, so it's convenient to talk about. We'll talk about the founding fathers generation. We'll talk about the build up to the Civil War, antebellum period. We'll talk about the Civil War. We'll talk about Reconstruction. We'll talk about the Gilded Age. We'll talk about the Progressive Era. We'll talk about, we break it into 20, 30-year chunks. When you're thinking about America as a superpower, there are obviously two chunks. One is from Pearl Harbor to the future, to the present and future, and one is Pearl Harbor backwards. So we are going to look at things a little differently. The first 5 of these are what we're going to focus on this evening. They are America mostly as an isolationist. Number 2 and number 3 are brief periods when we became imperialists, when we changed out of the pattern that we followed for the bulk of the 150 years. But for the first more than a century, 1787 to 1898, we were isolationist. Oh, not perfect. Again, if you ignore taking land from the Indians, but we kept out of European affairs. We got pulled into a couple of wars, the 3 wars that we talked about, because of the economic impact that these nations were having on our shipping. But we largely practiced isolationism and more successfully than we would in any other period of our history. 1898 is going to be different. 1898 is the Spanish-American War. And the Spanish-American War is America's first foray into imperialism. We fought against Spain and the big treasure we were looking for with Cuba. But we got other things. We got American Samoa, we got the Philippines, etc. Now the question is, why would we break our pattern of isolationism here? And there's a couple of reasons for that. One, Frederick Jackson Turner is a very famous American historian, and he wrote in 1890 that the American frontier was closed, that we'd completed our task, and Americans were feeling a little restless. Now, other historians have disagreed and said Jackson Turner was wrong, but people believed him, and Americans looked elsewhere. What do we do next? Where do we go? It's sort of like Alexander the Great, no more worlds to conquer. So we had to look outside ourselves. Number 2, we had become the great economy in the world. We were powerful economically, and there was a feeling among many people, if our economy is this strong, we ought to have a position in the world that reflects that. And the third, and maybe the more important one of the 3, this was the final wave of European colonialism, largely in Africa and Southeast Asia. It was the most violent wave of colonialism, but it was a moment in history in which the world was being carved up. And if we didn't get into that fight now, by the time we said, oh, I think we want to get into it, it would be too late. The world would already be divided. And so we went into it. Now, we didn't stay in it very long. What got us out? I think the big trigger was the Philippines. The Philippines, they had a bloody insurgency. They didn't like us there. And in order to put down an insurgency, we had to act like imperialists. We had to go in with strong arm tactics, with soldiers, and we killed people. And Americans were not happy with that. And they turned away and stopped supporting the politicians who were following those policies. And so very quickly we came out. We stayed out until World War I. And World War I, actually, we tried to stay out. If you remember, when Woodrow Wilson ran for president in 1916, he did it under the slogan, "I'll keep us out of the war." And then he changed. And what happened was an idealist side of Wilson. A side note, Woodrow Wilson was probably the most racist of the modern presidencies. He was a Virginian by birth. And when he got to the White House, he resegregated the White House, and his policies, if you were to talk to any Black historians, were awful in terms of how they treated the Black minority in our country. But here, in terms of the war, he was an idealist. And his idealism was, we will fight a war that will make the war safe for democracy, a war to end all wars. And what he thought was, you know what, here's the problem with warfare in our world. It's that one war begets another war begets another war, because when the war is over, people lick their wounds, try and centralize their power, and then they go back again. And he said, you know what, we got to change all this. There are all these secret alliances, all these games played in order to improve your position in the world. We have to say, none of that. We're going to end all these secret alliances. We'll create an institution, the League of Nations, which is a kind of predecessor to the UN, where nations can go to adjudicate their differences, their grievances, without going to war. So he thought it would be an idealistic thing. But Americans coming out of the war didn't buy it, because the war had been too costly. There had been something like 4 million soldiers we had had to mobilize at great cost. There were over 100,000 American soldiers who died, and another 200,000+ who were seriously injured. And we said, you know what, that's Europe's game. Washington said, don't get involved. We made a mistake, and we're not going to do it again. Now, that brings us to, I think, the most important period in our discussion tonight, the interwar years. The interwar years are going to be very, very important, because in the interwar years, we stayed isolated. You know, we're going to watch the rise of fascism and the rise of militarism around the globe, whether it's the Japanese invading Manchuria, whether it's the Italians invading Ethiopia, whether it's Italy and Spain practicing their blitzkrieg strategies in the Spanish Civil War. We watched all this happening and inevitably leading to a terrible conflagration in World War II. And we did and said nothing. Chamberlain, Neville Chamberlain of Britain, has been maligned by history for his appeasement of Hitler. We share some of that, because we, economically at the very least, were a giant power. But we didn't think it was our business. And we turned our heads and let go on things that would ultimately lead to World War II. Now, I just want to point out these two wars. World War I had 20 million casualties. Now, to put that in perspective, in the whole of the 19th century, the most destructive war in terms of casualties was the Franco-Prussian War, with about 250,000, 250,000 casualties. World War I has 20 million. World War II will have over 50 million. But it is the attack on Pearl Harbor that will change all that. Roosevelt was trying to get us at least to help the British, because war in Europe was going very, very badly. Britain was losing on all fronts. France fell in about a handful of weeks. The Nazis could have and control Europe very, 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 very soon. And FDR felt we needed to help Britain, whether it was just with planes and tanks and economic help, or whether it was getting into the war. But the isolationist strain was still strong in America. And in 1939 to 41, there was the America First movement. The America First movement was led by people like Charles Lindbergh, who was really the face of the movement, but it had Henry Ford and Joseph Kennedy, Avery Brundage, some major players. And they wanted to keep us out of World War II, because they said, this is going to be just like World War I, another mess we get into, a lot of American lives lost, a lot of American treasure spent, and it's Europe's mess. Let them figure it out. Then Pearl Harbor happens. Pearl Harbor is the fulcrum in this. And we move to a new phase where we say, it is not safe for us to ignore. We have to be one of the players in the international scene. And let me do that. All right, I'm back again. I think that this largely gets us to where we needed to get to pick up with part two. I apologize for the technical problem. It was my fault that we didn't film the first half. Next month, we'll do better. I hope that you go to the website and read the essay. I will put up a second essay prior to our meeting in October. And I thank you all. And let me close off here.